Spring 1862, on a muddy wharf along the James River, a small crowd stared at a crate that looked like it had been nailed together in a hurry. Inside the crate sat a barrel with seams tarred over and a pipe sticking out at an angle. A captain in worn gray called it an infernal machine and grinned as if the name itself could scare a fleet. A lieutenant from the river defense said it would never work. The captain shrugged. The river would decide. By the end of the war, the rivers and harbors would answer with a new word stamped in fear: mine. In the beginning, the devices did look like junk. They were kegs and boilers and casks and copper cans with crude caps, sparking wires and jury-rigged anchors. They were filled with powder when powder was precious. They floated where currents tugged, and they sank where ropes dragged. Sailors cursed them when they fouled a propeller and laughed when a boat hook brought up a soggy barrel that smelled like tar and hope. Then one exploded under a hull, and the laughter ended. The Confederacy called them torpedoes, a word that meant explosive traps in water, long before torpedo meant a self-propelled fish. Infernal machine was the older name, half sneer and half prayer, the label officers used when they were not sure if they were building genius or nonsense. They built them anyway, because they needed a weapon that turned narrow waters into walls. The Union had ironclads and gunboats and tugs and a navy that could push upriver with steam and will. The South had shallows, mud, and the patience to tie powder to anchors and run wires through reeds. At first the machines were simple: a keg packed with powder and a primer, a float to set depth, a rope to a weight on the bottom. If a hull brushed the trigger, the primer popped and the powder did what powder does. Sometimes the keg rotted. Sometimes the current dragged it out of position. Sometimes it burst and a hole opened in the river where a ship had been. Early reports sound almost embarrassed. A boat vanished. No one saw the shot. No one heard a cannon. The river itself seemed to bite. Union officers came to despise the word unseen. They could fight a fort with guns. They could fight a battery on a bluff. They could not fight a barrel that hid in brown water. They tried, of course. Crews dragged for lines with grapnels. They sent small boats ahead with poles. They fired at anything that looked like a float. They brought up rotten logs and old stumps, and once in a while a device that ticked softly like a watch asleep. Sometimes they brought up nothing, and a minute later a blast heaved a column of water taller than a mast. The South improved the devices with each explosion. Contact fuses gave way to triggers that did not cook off if a fish nudged the case. Electrical firing made a difference where it could be managed. A wire ran from the infernal machine to a shore station where a man with a galvanic battery waited with his hand on a key. He watched the channel. When a Union ship crossed the invisible point, he touched the key, and the mine answered. The trick was insulation, the long, wet length where leaky current could die, the joints where copper met gutta percha, the place where a careless foot could break the only thing that kept a harbor safe. Even so, the wire made admirals sweat, because it meant the machine was not guessing. A man was aiming it. Rivers became arguments over inches and timing. The Confederacy did not need to stop every ship. It needed to sink one loud and public ship in each contested stretch, and to let the wreck and the fear of the next wreck argue for the rest. Mines multiplied the power of shore guns. A captain steering into a channel marked by corpses of wood and iron did not hold his nerve the same way. He slowed where speed would have saved him from plunging fire. He bunched his vessels where dispersion would have saved him from a field of blasts. Infernal machines did not merely explode, they edited choices. Ironclads were supposed to make rivers safe for the Union. Thick iron plates, sloped sides, steam engines that shrugged off headwinds, heavy guns in turrets and casemates. They could trade with forts and gallop past bluffs. They could shrug at musketry. They could bully wooden gunboats. Mines asked a different question. How many plates can you stack between a hull and a blast that rises from underneath? An ironclad that laughed at round shot could not laugh at a hole punched where no gun could reach. Picture the routine of a Confederate mine crew anywhere along a contested river. They loaded powder in a shed that leaked light. They checked the wax on the joints and packed the fuses in oiled cloth. They dragged the case on a wagon to a skiff and rode into dusk, because dusk hid a man and his nerves. They paid out line and felt the current tug. They talked quietly while mosquitoes landed on their wrists and the reeds hissed with every small thing that swam. A man in the bow tapped the case like a friend's shoulder and let it slide into water with a pitying look. That pity was honest. If the case failed, no one would forgive the hours. If it worked, someone would drown. He knew which someone he wanted, and he also knew that powder is a democracy that cannot vote for targets. He rowed back without speaking to anyone on the bank, and went home without glory. Now shift to a deck lit by lanterns where Union sailors stand with poles and listen for the sound no one can quite describe. They have been told to hunt barrels. They have seen barrels explode. They have also seen barrels that seem to have no business exploding do exactly that. They tap water in front of the bow with poles that feel like toothpicks laid against an alligator. The river smells like rotting leaves and fear. A petty officer tells a joke he has told before. No one laughs. The captain orders one more cast with the grapnels, and the boat hooks bring up weeds and one sodden shoe. Then the ship eases through and nothing happens. A mile later, the ship hits an invisible seam across the channel, and the poet's phrase becomes literal. The river bites. News travels down rivers faster than steam sometimes. A boat goes under, and that night men along the bank share the story with brand-new details that may or may not be true, but all of which make the mines bigger in every listener's mind. Soon, even the devices that do not explode help hold the rivers. A line of dark buoys in a narrow stretch is a psychological barrage. The Union develops countermeasures that are all about nerve. Spar boats feel ahead of the column. Small craft tow rakes. Sailors stand on shelves and touch the water with brooms. Gunners aim at a channel with no target because discipline says, keep men in the enemy's heads. All of this is energy spent against fear. The Confederacy counts that as a victory even before a fuse burns. The South coupled mines with other asymmetries. A spar torpedo attached to a fast little boat could charge and touch a hull. A diver with a charge and a rope could work near a wharf by night. A recoilless land battery firing a cobbled-together projectile at a range that maps called impossible could scare a pilot into a line that a hidden minefield had been waiting to punish. At every point, the goal was the same. Make the Union spend time and attention. Make it fear the next 10 yards. make a small shop full of powder and wire count for a gunboat full of machine. The adjective junk stayed alive among Union officers longer than you might think. It is a hard habit to shake, this contempt for crude things. You can see why. A mine looked like a farmhand's afternoon. A line looked like a clothesline. A fuse house looked like a shed where someone's uncle fixed clocks. But contempt makes men lazy. Mines did not ask the Union to be impressed. Mines asked the Union to bleed, and often enough. That is what happened. When an ironclad that had shrugged off batteries and storms and bad navigation went down to a trap, even the most scornful captain added a new word to his prayers. Please, please let us drift where there is nothing. Some Confederate officers understood precisely how contempt could be used. They encouraged spies to talk about boxes that leaked, and powder that clumped, and crews that could not read a watch. They let rumors spread that every third device was a dud, and that the men who set them were half drunk on bad whiskey. Then a heavy ship exploded, and the rumor learned humility. The best propaganda a mine ever had was the geyser of water it threw, and the silence that followed while men counted who was left above the waterline. The technology did not stand still. Anchoring grew smarter. Mines were set to float just below a certain depth, so that shallow draft vessels might pass, while deep draft capital ships could not. Fields were laid in irregular patterns to defeat the methodical man who expected math he could memorize. Some were connected in series so that a single key could arm or disarm a stretch at once, allowing friendly boats to pass by signal. Batteries ashore were paired with mine lines so that an enemy heading for a gap would have to choose between a quick death or a slow one. The Confederacy lacked many things. It did not lack ideas when it came to water. Union ingenuity was not idle. Engineers built mine-sweeping gear that looked ridiculous and sometimes worked. Iron rakes bolted to the bow, chains dragging between boats to snag lines, weighted grapnels that explored the bottom like blind men reading Braille. Men learned to read water the way a hunter reads grass, to see the tiny nervous ripples where a float line pulled, to smell insulation that had the faint chemical scent of an armory. A new trade grew inside the Navy with its own bravado and its own superstitions. It was not glamorous. It got you killed when someone else's morning work had been good. It also saved ships, and that is all a Navy ever asks of a dirty job. The moral argument never fully left the conversation. Was this fighting fair? Does a nation lower itself by hiding bombs where sailors cannot see them? The question echoed down decks and into newspapers. Southern voices said the ironclad had already rewritten fairness. If the enemy built floating forts, then the correct answer was to prick them from below with a poor man's spear. Northern voices said war was already unfair, and that men who fought without showing themselves took something from the code that kept horrors from getting worse. The River did not publish editorials. It only kept score. When you pull back from the single blast to the long war, the story clarifies. Mines did not win the war for the Confederacy. Nothing did. But mines did bend campaigns. They delayed advances by weeks on certain rivers. They kept patrols short and careful where patrols had been bold. They gave batteries extra hours before they were silenced. They taught commanders to weight the unknown more heavily in their decisions. And above all, They set the stage for the future when nations would seed seas with patient machines and call it strategy. Consider a single harbor as a lesson writ small. The entrance is a channel between two bars. Shore guns stand on small forts and in temporary works made from sand and timbers. A line of mines runs across the channel on a slant, and a second line runs offset behind the first. A wire house under a bluff holds a man at a key. He watches a range marker and a beacon. He has orders not to press the key until the biggest target is in the box painted by the markers. The tide runs fast. Pilots know it loudly, and men in Washington know it faintly. A Union squadron arrives. The flagship leads. Boats pull ahead, dragging and probing. The flagship hesitates on the edge of the map she carries in her head. The captain commits because the army needs a landing and he is tired of being called slow. The key man on the bluff presses a brass rectangle with a thumbnail. The mine answers. The flagship lifts and falls and stops answering. The rest of the squadron stops moving. Shore guns take the gift of stationary targets and do what guns do. In the afternoon, the flagship still rests on the bar. In the evening, the tide has its way, and the ship turns on her wound. Men on both sides write letters that night. One tells his sister about the geyser, one tells his wife about the key. Both use the word miracle in their own way. There are scenes that deserve their own place in a long telling. A small boat skims past a line of pickets on a river that smells like summer. Two men in the bow hold a spar with a charge on it and aim at the black shadow of a hull. They are trying to do slow murder so that their friends on shore can keep bread in their mouths. They have already decided they will die if the fuse works. They ram the spar home. The water thumps their chests. Their boat leaps. The enemy ship shudders. They vanish into bubbles and oil, and the spar drifts free of hands that will never hold anything again. That moment is not a mine, but it is kin. It is the same physics and the same hope that asymmetry can pay debts. Or this scene. A diver walks along a rope 20 feet down near a wharf where iron rings clink in a regular rhythm in the tide. He carries a tin of powder and a slow match wrapped in waxed linen. He ties the tin to a barnacle-scarred timber and lights the match, because no one has taught him a better way to do this yet. He kicks for the surface and hopes he has judged the match correctly. He hopes the sentry on the wharf cannot see a man rising who brings death in a can. He hopes that the fuse does not drown. He hopes the powder is dry. He hopes, and then the timber explodes and a section of wharf collapses like a curtain cut from a stage. This is not a modern war. It is a desperate one, and the mine is a teacher that desperation can still write new doctrine. We should measure, too, because numbers keep stories honest. How many ships did mines sink? Enough to be noticed, enough to be cursed, enough that special orders were written and revised. How often did a minefield hold a fleet at bay for a day or a week? Often enough that men learned the names of small bends on rivers they had never seen before. How frequently did a dud save a ship? Often enough that lucky men kept their lives and unlucky men learned how bad luck feels when it belongs to someone else. The balance sheet tilts toward fear as much as toward metal. Fear is free once purchased with one explosion in the right place. Industrial details matter because the Confederate Infernal machine was as much a factory story as a battlefield story. Powder mills had to keep up. Metal workers had to spin and solder cases. Wire had to be ordered and insulated with gutta percha or India rubber, materials that were themselves supply chain adventures. Men had to learn to tie knots that would not rot. Anchors had to be heavy enough, but not drag the line into a drift that betrayed the device. Every tiny failure upstream could explode later as silence when a key was pressed. And yet, given those hazards, the system worked often enough to change the way the other side moved. That is success at a scale that modest shops can be proud of forever. There is a human cost that belongs in this telling, not to scold or to sanctify, but to remember. Mines kill men who never see the face of the person who set the charge. They drown sailors who can swim but cannot find a way out of a flooded compartment in time. They break legs and backs with one hard slam. They crush lungs with pressure and then burn skin with steam. In memory, they become statistics. In the minute, they are screams and cold and oil. A captain who calls them cowardly may be trying to save his soul more than trying to write doctrine. A lieutenant who calls them righteous may be trying to forget a face. The river keeps their secrets and flows on. By the last year of the war, the Union understood that mines were not a nuisance to be swept aside with curses. They were part of the map. Countermining became part of the plan. Intelligence meant counting how many spools of wire had been shipped to a river town and guessing where those spools would find a bank and a shed. Raids targeted fuse houses and powder stores. Shells that once would have been fired at a fort were sometimes sent toward a stretch of innocent-looking water because someone ashore thought he saw a ripple that did not belong to tide. A navy learns. It does not need to love the lesson. When peace came, the devices got better names and new countries adopted them. Torpedoes kept their old meaning in some books and gained new meanings in others. Mines became the sober term that professionals used when they drew charts with dotted lines. The lesson the river had taught did not die. It learned to cross oceans. It returned in wars that made the Civil War look small, and it showed generals again that a barrel with powder inside can be more than a prank. It can be strategy. Return for a moment to that muddy wharf at the start. The lieutenant who said never was not a fool. He was a man trained to trust things with polish and breech rings and factories behind them. He could not see a fleet's nerves shatter at the sight of a buoy. He could not see a keyman's thumb twitch at the perfect second. He could not see a future where entire passages in textbooks would be devoted to invisible fields of waiting death. He saw a barrel and a rope. He learned, like the rest, that war sometimes loves barrels and ropes. The story of Confederate infernal machines is not the story of a wonder weapon. It is the story of a poor side learning how to make a rich side pause. It is the story of men who could not build a dozen ironclads, building 100 traps instead, and discovering that the traps could hold a river just long enough to matter. It is the story of contempt punished and of desperation rewarded, just enough to keep the desperate trying. It is the story of a new word entering a navy's mouth with a sour taste and lingering there ever after. So here is the moral placed in plain speech. Do not laugh at junk if it floats toward you with a wire trailing behind. Do not assume that a crude case cannot be a clock. Do not mistake a shed for a joke when a careful man and a battery sit inside with cups of coffee gone cold. And if you find yourself steering a heavy ship into a narrow place with history on both banks, remember every barrel anyone ever hid in a current, and proceed as if the river were alive and entitled to opinions. Confederate infernal machines looked like junk. Then naval mines sank Union ironclads. The sentence is not a flourish. It is a ledger entry in the account book of war. It reminds us that the face of a weapon tells you nothing. The effect tells you everything. A barrel in brown water can be an idea wearing mud. An idea like that tends to outlive the men who first tried it. It tends to grow teeth. It tends to turn rivers into sentences written with powder, and the punctuation is a sudden fountain of water that ends with a quiet surface and a list of names. This is a long story because the minutes after an explosion stretch wider than the minutes before. After the blast, men hovered and waited for a second and a third. They turned ships with care that looked like fear and was actually respect. They learned to send out boats, then to bring them back, then to stand down, and all the while the river watched them the way an animal watches another animal decide whether to drink. That is the other lesson mines teach. Water looks calm when it is most dangerous. Calm is sometimes camouflage. War thrives on camouflage. Remember the crew on shore, the one with the key. He is not a magician. He is a clerk with nerves, a listener to timing, a reader of wakes. He misjudges sometimes, and the blast rises behind a stern or ahead of a bow and does nothing but frighten. He judges right sometimes, and the blast lifts a hull and breaks it, and he sits down suddenly because he has just killed men and kept his own side alive, and the two facts coexist badly. He drinks cold coffee and stares at the key. He will keep staring for years in his head. That is another truth of infernal machines. They make private ghosts for men who handle them. Think of the Union sailors who learned to respect the invisible. They were not cowards. They stood on decks under forts. They pushed up bends where rifles could thread their decks. They fought currents and fires. They just learned that the water did not belong to them no matter what flag flew. They learned that a barrel nailed together on a Tuesday could hold a ship on a Friday. They learned that anything that moves at 3 knots through a brown channel is a hostage to something set on a rope 2 nights ago by a man who owns no shoes. That is a form of equality in war. It is not the kind that makes anyone cheerful. It is the kind that keeps admirals awake. We might finish by speaking to the present with words from the past. Minds make patience powerful. Minds punish the impatient. They turn geography into a weapon you need to sweep with your mind before you sweep with chains. They make cheap factories as dangerous as expensive ones when those factories are animated by planning and nerve. And they remind us that technology in war is not always a gleaming blade. Sometimes it is a tarred seam and a length of wire, and a man who knows which point in the channel is the point where you should not breathe. Confederate infernal machines looked like junk. They did their work anyway. Naval mines sank Union ironclads. The rivers recorded the results in silence, and the word mine rolled forward into new wars. If you stand on a bank today and look at a calm surface, remember that history hides under water more easily than on land. Somewhere below, a barrel once dreamed of a ship. The ship did not know it had entered a dream until the dream woke with a bright white flash and a tower of water. The rest was quiet except for the names called and not answered. The river kept flowing while men argued on shore about junk and genius. The river, as always, had already chosen. Now we add the deeper canvas of cases because the length of this tale deserves anchors. Think of a river in Mississippi country where a squadron pressed forward to lift a blockade of mud and fear. A gunboat eased into a bend so tight that the pilot could touch willow leaves. He knew the shallows by color and the snags by memory. He did not know the mine line. A slight shimmering seam ran across the channel like a knife mark on old wood. The bow crossed the seam, and a white pillar shot up under the boilers. Men on deck saw sky before they saw water again. When the river closed, only spars showed. The rest turned to a cautionary tale told in every wardroom. Shift to mobile waters where buoys bobbed like dotted letters and forts spoke with heat. An ironclad led with confidence that had carried her through storms. She nosed toward the gap, and men on shore wondered if she could really be that brave. She could not. The blast lifted her like a hand lifts a toy and set her back crooked. In minutes she lay with only masts showing, while the fleet behind tried to decide whether to turn or follow, and a famous line was shouted that made courage a command. The command did not raise the ironclad, but it did force the fleet to accept that the map had changed because of barrels and powder and the careful work of men in sheds. In sounds and inlets where tides ran faster than orders, mines taught pilots new prayers. A fair tide is not always fair. It can carry a ship faster than spars can feel and plant a hull on a nose of sand exactly where a line waits beneath. The mine cares nothing for your schedule or for your letter home. It waits and measures the time with patience unlike any animal. A man grows tired. A mine does not. A man flinches. A mine never does. Let us speak of the craft of laying a field, because it is a craft as much as a tactic. You begin with a map in your head of where ships prefer to pass. You add the places where pilots are forced to pass. You lay your devices not exactly where a clever man expects, but close enough that habit brings him to harm. You vary depth so that small boats can probe and report success, while the big hull still glides toward the belly of the plane. You secure each case with a faith in knots and weights, and you check the line in a week and then in a month. The river tries to ruin your work. You must love the river enough to argue back. The men who did this work came from workshops and farms, and they learned to read currents the way old men read faces. They learned the smells that meant a case had leaked, and the colors that meant a casing was sound. They learned to coil wire the right way, so that it paid out without kinking, and to scrape a contact clean without tearing it. They learned that a careless step on a line at the wrong moment could turn a crew into a story. They learned to walk away from their own work with patience, because the praise for a mine is invisible right up to the second it is not. Across the lines, men learned to read water as if it were scripture. A change in ripples meant a hidden shape. A feather of scum along a straight line meant a drift against a rope. A piece of bark that moved against current meant a float line under tension. When your life depends on water, you learn to listen to water. It is not a supernatural gift. It is practice paid for in men's names. Add to this picture the cooperation that mines forced. A battery commander watches the channel through a glass and marks a spot in his mind where he thinks the key man ashore will act. He walks his guns onto that place with elevations that have been scratched and re-scratched on a plank. When the blast comes, he orders case against what he hopes is a stunned deck. He may be wrong. He may be right. He has accepted that the explosion is the drumbeat in a song he is trying to sing. This is combined arms in a place where arms rarely combine, and it exists because a barrel changed the tempo of a fight. The psychology deserves its own chapter. Mines turn a river into a rumor mill. Every splash is suspect. Every log is a liar. Every buoy is a dare. A captain becomes a gambler against a dealer who does not blink. He learns to love small, reliable boats more than big, proud ones, because small boats test and big boats pay. He learns to trust the men in the smallest craft in his fleet and to reward them with the only coin they value, which is survival and the respect of men who used to ignore them. He learns that glory belongs to the man with the key on shore and the man in the dinghy with a grapnel as much as it belongs to the man on the quarterdeck. Now widen the lens to the economy of this weapon. A mine costs powder, metal, labor, and knowledge. An ironclad costs much more of all four. When a cheaper thing can meaningfully threaten a dear thing, strategy tilts. The Confederacy could not afford to trade gunboats for gunboats. It could afford to trade barrels for gunboats. That affordability made courage a better investment. A nation that cannot outbuild can still outthink by forcing the enemy to act as if barrels were ships. That is not romance. That is math. The math continues into time. A mine forces delay, which forces resupply, which forces longer lines of communication, which forces more coal and more repair and more friction. If a mine stops a fleet for a week, it steals a month from the campaign's momentum. If a mine forces a fleet to send for specialized gear and men, it steals from other theaters where that gear and those men would have been. A small factory on a brown river can therefore reach into a general's calendar 2 states away and smudge the pencil lines. That reach is worth more than a single blast. Let us return to the men with the keys. They became strange priests of this new right, sitting in huts that smelled like oil and fear. Some grew too cautious and pressed too late. Some grew too eager and pressed too early. The good ones learned to wait until the ship's bow covered a range mark, and the wake broke just so. Then they pressed, and the water accepted their offering. No statue was raised to them. Their sermons were geysers. Their congregation was the enemy's dead. On the other side, certain sailors became famous in a narrow way for their ability to find the unfriendly things. They carried grapnels like talismans. They wore slivers of copper under caps, convinced that metal would attract metal. They named their boats with bitter jokes and painted luck on the bows. They were not always right about the water, but they were right enough to save hulls that would have been holes. They lived in a small fraternity that understood it was loved and hated by the same men who signed their orders. The war ended, as such wars do, with exhausted men who had learned complicated lessons. One of those lessons was written in river silt. You can change strategy with trash and patience. You can make a river into a weapon, and then you must live with the knowledge that the river will remember how to be a weapon when you want it to be a road again. It is easy to fill water with fear. It is hard to empty it afterward. Peace did not throw away the idea. The idea grew formal and international. Manuals were written. Schools taught men how to seed channels and how to sweep them. New fuses arrived that waited for pressure or sound or magnets. New arguments started that sounded old. Is this fair? Is this honorable? The river, now larger and called an ocean, still did not publish editorials. It kept score. Ships still lifted and fell and vanished. Key men became switch men and then radar men. The old barrels are in museums. The lesson is not. We are nearly done, but the length of this telling deserves a final braid of voices. Hear the Confederate captain who said we will make the water fight for us. Hear the Union sailor who said the water is not our friend today. Hear the engineer who said I can make a battery speak along a wet wire. Hear the pilot who said I know this bend and I do not know this bend anymore. Hear the man with the grapnel who said there is something here and I do not yet know if it will kill us. Hear the man at the key who said now. Hear the silence that followed and decide if junk can end a sentence. Confederate infernal machines looked like junk. Then naval mines sank Union ironclads. The rivers and harbors recorded the facts. The men remembered the fear. The rest of us inherit the lesson. Cheap can be deadly. Invisible can be decisive. Patience can be strategy. And water always, always keeps a memory of the worst thing it once did. If you ever find yourself in a museum looking at a rusted sphere with a crooked pipe, do not laugh at it. Imagine a quiet hut with a key. Imagine a brown river. Imagine a black column of water that lifted a steel hull like a toy and then set it down differently. Imagine a list of names carved somewhere inland far from any tide. Then read the small placard again. It will say mine. The word is small. The consequences were not. We close by returning to that wharf where the crate first opened. The lieutenant who doubted and the captain who believed both grew old in different ways. One told stories about the day he learned respect for barrels. The other told stories about the day the enemy learned respect for barrels. Between their stories is the whole war in miniature, a quarrel over what looks like junk and what actually works. Somewhere between those two truths, a river shrugged, swallowed, and then kept flowing as if men did not matter at all. That is water's right. Men simply argued on the banks about what they had seen. Confederate infernal machines looked like junk. The Union learned to call them mines. The world kept the word. The water kept the secret. The lesson endures in every narrow place where a ship slows and a captain tastes metal in his mouth without knowing why. That taste is history. That taste is fear. That taste is the ghost of barrels nailed together in a hurry on a muddy wharf a long time ago. Now we widen the history and walk harbor by harbor, river by river, so the shape of this weapon appears in full. Charleston's channels taught both sides patience. Shoals shifted like sleeping animals. Forts guarded arcs of water with guns that had learned the names of tides. Into this puzzle the Confederates threaded lines, some armed by wire, some by contact, all by intent. Union commanders stared at charts that looked like crosshatch and worry. A single buoy might be a warning, a decoy, or a lie. A line of them might be a fence or a rumor. Probing crews found devices where the chart said none, and empty water where the chart said beware. That mismatch was not incompetence. It was the river being alive and the defenders understanding that life enough to improvise. Every week of delay was a page torn from an invasion schedule. Every wreck was an exclamation point in the margin. In the Cape, fear approaches, the lesson repeated in salt and sand. Blockade runners loved those inlets, thin lines of deep water threading past bars that could catch a careless hull like a hook. Confederate devices found homes in the lanes the runners did not need. It is a simple thing to say and a hard thing to counter. Mine the enemy's road, leave your own footpath clear, and shift the traps the moment the enemy thinks he has mapped them. Tug captains, pilots, enlisted men with sleeves rolled to the elbow. These became cartographers of fear, updating charts with pencil smudges that meant, here we lived yesterday, here we may die tomorrow. Follow the James and you meet industry in reed beds. Workshops rose where once there were only boat landings. The torpedo bureau sketched, tested, revised. Copper was rolled and hammered, solder warmed and flowed, gutta percha softened and then set hard around wire like armor. Young men who might have apprenticed on plows learned to wind coils and seal seams. Old river hands taught them to read current and tie something that would not slip under a tug from a winter flood. The Bureau's best tricks were not diagrams, they were habits. Count twice, dry the powder again, test the battery at dawn and again at dusk. Leave nothing to morning that can be done before dark. Habits are strategy in quiet clothes. We should speak the names that belong in this chapter of the story, because devices do not design themselves. Engineers and officers argued over shapes and triggers, over whether a cone rides truer than a sphere in a current, over whether two small charges are better than one heavy one, over how best to anchor when the bottom is mud one week and scoured sand the next. Their disagreements produced variety, and variety itself became a defense. An enemy that solves one pattern meets another on Tuesday. The river smiles at his expertise and offers him a different quiz. Add a technical deep dive, spoken plainly. A contact mine needs a body that survives a season, a trigger that will not fire from driftwood but will fire from a hull, a charge with enough power to break the keel or at least flood compartments, and a way to hold the device at the right depth. The trigger might be a glass vial of acid waiting to break and wake a primer, or a spring-loaded striker waiting for a push that only steel can give. The charge is powder, carefully dried, packed in a case that resists water without trapping too much heat. The depth is the cruel part. Too shallow, and the blast boils water and frightens without breaking. Too deep, and the pressure smothers the effect. Getting that right with a barrel and a rope is not crude. It is skill, the sort born at benches and tested under gray skies. An electrically fired mine adds other layers. Insulation becomes king. A shore station whispers a small current through copper that the river longs to eat. Every splice is a prayer in wax and cloth. The operator watches two marks ashore line up with a mast and waits for the moment when the hull sits exactly where geometry says the cone of effect will touch. Press too soon and foam, press too late and regret, press just right and the water arches into a cathedral of white that collapses as confetti of iron and wood, and men fall back into the nave. The operator is not heroic in the painted sense. He is precise in the way a safe bridge feels precise when a family drives across it. Precision is a quiet kind of heroism. Union countermeasure craft earned their own mythology. Crews learned to stitch chain into nets and stretch them between picket boats, learned to rig sweeps from spars, lashed together like crude combs for the river's hair. They dragged and dragged, hour after hour, because the only proof that a channel is clean is the fact that a big ship passes, and sometimes even that proof is a liar. The work produced a kind of superstition that looks like religion from the shore. Certain boats were lucky. Certain men could smell powder. Certain spots hated grapnels. None of it was true in a scientific sense. All of it reflects what happens when risk is chronic and outcomes binary. A mind makes patterns because patterns feel like control. Now pull out to theater scale, because the mine was never just a local trick. When an admiral informs a general that the fleet will be late, the general changes the date on his orders for a march. He adjusts rations. He reconsiders a river crossing on day 10 and thinks about day 12. He listens to scouts report a rise in enemy numbers and wonders if the pause at the harbor mouth gave the other side time to concentrate. He sends cavalry farther to forage because the depot resupply will slip. A minefield laid by men in shirt sleeves echoes in a staff tent 100 miles away. This is how cheap trouble pays rich dividends. We have not yet discussed the legal words that tried to corral the weapon. Declarations and treatises argued about hidden devices versus notified ones, about whether a buoy or a posted warning could make the sea fair even when death waited beneath. In practice, law scrambled to keep up with practice, as it often does. The only consistent rule was the one written by tide and timber. If you sail into a narrow place controlled by an enemy with imagination, you do so at his pleasure. Captains grumbled about legality in their logs after a ship survived a field. Widows did not write legal essays. They wrote names on headstones. Let us rewind to earlier centuries for a few minutes to place the Civil War mine in a lineage. There were cunning men and pamphlets in Europe that proposed floating bombs against hulls. There were inventors along American shores in the last war with Britain who experimented with kegs and wires and learned more from failure than success. What the Confederacy did was scale the idea, strip it down to essentials, and marry it to local knowledge of water. That combination, scale, simplicity, local knowledge, is the repeating formula of effective asymmetry. You can see it in other wars with other tools. In this one, it wore tar and copper and grief. A long hour deserves case studies told slow. Imagine the Roanoke, where channels forked like choices in a bad dream. A Federal gunboat eased along a course familiar to pilots who felt it in their bones. The Confederates had studied those bones and laid devices not at the obvious bend, but where the wind on most days pushed a helpless drift that nudged hulls one boat width off comfort. The gunboat rode that wind as her kind had 100 times. Men on shore nodded. The operator at the key waited until the stern anchor line was taut, a sign that the pilot had decided to back water and hold position, and then he pressed. The blast was not the largest of the war. It did not need to be. In shallow water, lift matters more than drama. The hull rose, shifted, and settled crooked. Pumps started. Boats dropped. The ship became a lesson the size of a house that said, "You may know this river. We know it better." In Mobile Bay, the drama was grander, but the logic the same. A path marked safe was safe until it wasn't. Buoys become lies because men move them. Charts become traps because men edit them. An admiral must decide whether to trust dead ink or living water. The famous line that sent ships surging past danger was as much surrender to probability as it was a declaration of nerve. Even as the fleet roared through, the water kept its secrets. Some devices were asleep, some were gone, some, had fate hiccuped, would have spoken. That is another truth. Minefields are stochastic weapons. They are maps of likelihood, not calendars of appointment. Their power lies in forcing an enemy to behave as if every square yard is certain death. The Confederate Torpedo Bureau, often starved of material, paid attention to teaching. Manuals distilled hard-won lessons into sentences any corporal could carry in his head. Do not set too shallow in winter. Ice will murder your work. Do not trust a single anchor where the tide runs like a horse. Do not lay a field you cannot visit again. If you cannot wire the device, accept the limits of contact triggers and place them where pilots cannot bear to give room. These are not romantic doctrines. They are humble, and humility is the most underrated trait in war. Humility says, "The river is stronger than you. Align your will to its habits." Across the front lines, Union officers wrote their own plain commandments. Assume a channel is mined if the enemy had time. Assume he had time if you were busy elsewhere. Assume the device you find is not alone. Assume the men who laid the field know your habits better than you know their patience. Assume that a foggy morning is a favor to them, not to you. With those assumptions, lives were saved. Without them, iron sank. A full hour allows us to walk into the workshop and listen to the arguments that sound like tinkers and theologians sharing a bench. One man insists that a sphere is strongest by nature and resists the crush of depth. Another says a tapered end presents less drag to tide, and so rides truer. A third sits with a ledger and says both of you are missing the point. We can make 10 tapered cases with the metal and labor we have for 6 spheres. The best design is the one you can lay in numbers that change behavior. They do not resolve the argument to everyone's satisfaction, but the ledger keeper tends to win when powder is dear. We have spoken of fear from the deck. Here fear from the shore for balance. The man at the key sits through thunderstorms that make the battery hiss and pop. He keeps his hands on his knees lest foolishness touch metal when lightning might be thinking similar thoughts. He listens for hooves that might mean a raid will steal his work with a torch. He bites bread that tastes of oil because everything in his hut tastes of oil now. He wants a result, but he has learned to want control more than noise. He is growing old in the span of a season. He will be 30 in 2 months, with a back like an old miller's. He is a kind of soldier who never fires a gun and never sleeps well. Consider logistics, so we do not leave the dry men out of a wet story. Powder must be moved inland when enemy raids threaten mills. Copper must be bought with promises because cash is faithless. Wire must be scavenged from telegraph lines no longer trusted for messages. Boats must be hidden where egrets, not spies, land. Men who lift sacks must be thanked, because a sack that splits in a skiff in the wrong place becomes a rumor of failure that thins courage farther downriver. There is a parish worth of care behind a single bang. We should not romanticize duds, but we should read them. When a device fails, it returns a list of scoldings. The case leaked, the powder caked, the contact corroded, the depth shifted with a storm. The operator was ill and his replacement pressed early. Each scolding becomes a repair or a policy. Soon the dud rate declines. When the enemy keeps sailing after your mistakes, he grows superstitious and careless. When your mistakes become rarer, he grows cautious at the worst moments for him. You do not need perfection. You need ugly improvement and patience. Look ahead one last time beyond the war. Mines become part of naval doctrine worldwide. Charts include zones with dotted warnings that look like freckles on the ocean's skin. New devices learn to wait for magnet or pressure, to remember ships by signature, to wake when a count reaches the right number. New countermeasures bring cables that hum, sleds that plow the sea floor, aircraft that see through water with eyes built of radio waves. The conversation never ends. It only changes grammar. But at the root of every modern sentence in that conversation is the same subject and verb from our story. Barrels exploded. Now, because we have earned the quiet, return to one ship on one night. The river smells of wet rope and wood smoke. The pilot stands with a hand on the wheel and a memory of safe water fighting the new lessons of fear. He stays inside the range of a fort's guns a little longer than he should because the deeper water lies near a buoy he does not trust. The army ashore waits for ammunition that sleeps in his hold. The men at the quay in a hut beyond a turn wait for him. He proceeds at half speed. The fort sends a few casual shells. He flinches at each splash. He thinks about the widow of a friend whose boat jumped and never landed. He tells his engine room to hold that blessed half speed. He reaches the bend. The quay presses. The water harvests him. The fort cheers in a voice that says more about relief than hatred. The river goes back to pretending it is innocent. A clerk writes a line in a log. A general amends a plan. A family learns a new word by reading a telegram. That is the chain. That is the hour, stretched by seconds into choices. If you want to know why this mattered then and matters now, listen past the noise for the lesson that has marched through all these paragraphs. Technology does not have to be elegant to be decisive. It has to be fitted to terrain, multiplied by habit, and believed in by men who will carry it through boredom and dread. Confederate infernal machines were crude in the hand and refined in the mind. They turned water into a collaborator. They made admirals whisper. They saved regiments days of marching they would have bled through. They failed often. They succeeded enough. Strategy lives in that phrase. And so we end where we began, with a crate on a wharf and skeptics on both banks. The crate opens. The barrel winks with tar. Someone snorts. Someone smiles. The barrel goes to a skiff. The skiff slips into brown water. The river adds the barrel to its memory and waits. The waiting is the weapon. The rest is witness. Confederate infernal machines looked like junk. Naval mines sank Union ironclads. Between those two statements lies a world of wire, powder, men, fear, patience, and rivers that never needed any of us but learned our names anyway. There is more to say, because an hour does not exhaust a river any more than a single blast exhausts a minefield. Name two men whose fingerprints are all over this story. One charted oceans before he charted wires. He thought in currents and stars, and could not look at a river without measuring its intentions. He did not love war, but he loved puzzles, and a minefield is a puzzle with a fuse. The other walked fields in mud and taught farmers and soldiers alike that a simple device, multiplied and placed with judgment, can change an army's appetite for ground. One brought the cosmopolitan mind of charts and science to the problem. The other brought the provincial genius of soil and seasons. Together, in spirit if not in meetings, they made a doctrine that could fit in a small shed and spread across a long coast. Explain doctrine plainly, so that even a tired private at the oars can repeat it. Deny the deepest water. Force the enemy into flats where he scrapes, slows, and cants. Shield your own lanes with devices you can disarm at will. Pair detonations with guns so that when steel stands still, iron speaks from shore. Move your fields after your first success to keep his engineers honest. Do not boast about the number of devices. Boast about days stolen. Count victory in calendars, not just in carcasses. These sentences can be memorized. That is why they work. Doctrine that requires diagrams will fail at midnight in a thunderstorm. Doctrine that fits in a mouth will survive. Now tell stories from the Union side that deserve as much space as any Confederate boast. A small screw steamer assigned to sweep an approach drags rakes for a day and brings up two devices, both frightening and both duds. The captain returns to his anchorage and writes in his log that the enemy is incompetent. The next morning his ship moves forward with a sister vessel behind. The sister takes the blow that would have been his. Logbooks grow subtle after that. A big ironclad anchored in what had yesterday been a safe pocket finds new devices set in the night. Her officers watch small lights move ashore and understand that an enemy who works harder at night than you do by day will write maps you cannot correct in time. A gunboat commander who once mocked barrels and rumors begins to sleep badly because he has learned that barrels and rumors can kill his friends as surely as any fort. Weather writes footnotes large enough to be chapters. In flood season, lines go taut, anchors drag, devices migrate to places they do not belong. In drought, channels narrow and mines that once lurked safely below become half-seen shapes that warn and yet still kill. In winter, ice is an ally to the attacker and a traitor to the defender. It saws lines and crushes cases and makes every reach a tangle. In summer, algae coats everything in a green film that creeps into contacts and steals spark. The best mine officer is the one who plans for seasons a month before they arrive. He salts the powder. He doubles the moorings. He marks new ranges that account for a shoal that will grow like a rumor when the river falls. He acts as if the river were an intelligent conspirator, because in practice it is. Training turns caution into competence. Shore parties practice laying dummy fields until their hands move without speech. Operators drill with dry batteries and target boats. Infantry platoons learn to guard wires with a vigilance normally reserved for generals because a knife on a copper line is a quieter victory than a charge up a slope. Sailors learn signals for sweeps and rakes and adopt them as if they have always been in the book. The work is not glamorous. It is arms crossed on a cold night, eyes on a dark lane of water. It is rope burns and skinned knuckles. It is a sergeant counting seconds aloud because the new man must feel that time has a taste. Fine, let him taste it here in practice, not with a hull under him. We will not dodge the accidents because every hard lesson has a ledger written in pain. A device detonates while being set because a careless hand did not secure a striker. A shore station burns because a tallow lamp's heat woke sparks from an untidy bench. A sweep boat sinks because two lines crossed under a swell and a tangle cinched around a propeller like a noose. Afterward, men who live write new rules and speak them with a severity that sounds cruel until you remember the names on the list. Myths are born at those moments, too. A sainted sailor who always knew where not to row, a villain who never learned which knots to trust. The truth sits somewhere in the middle, as it usually does. Fatigue and chance hold hands in war. Economics insists on a say. Powder measured by the pound turns into days stolen by the week when correctly applied. Copper priced by the foot turns into caution measured by miles. The cost per casualty is a brutal phrase, but staff officers think it, and sergeants feel it. When a single case placed well causes a squadron to burn coal for a fortnight without gaining a yard, the return on investment is savage. When a field is laid badly and swept in an afternoon, the ledger bites back. You cannot run a war on poetry. You run it on ledgers written by men who still smell powder when they sit at a desk. We speak of ironclads as if they were invulnerable until ugly surprises corrected the tone. Consider their underbellies. Plates did not continue below the waterline with the same arrogance they showed above. Wood and iron, seams and bolts, all the busy, complicated joints that make engines and pumps live. These live where a mind desires to touch. You could thicken a deck and layer a casemate. You could not, in that era, armor the parts that must be light and moving below. A mine is a specialist that seeks the softest place of the proudest thing. That is why it felt like cheating to men who had come to believe in hardware as a theology. The mine was heresy. Heresy often wins debates in the long run. Make room for the inland seas as well as the salt. The great rivers were highways, fronts, and nerves. Mines there became not only weapons, but borders. A field at a bend could split a theater into a place you own and a place you might one day borrow. River towns learned to listen for blasts the way coastal towns listen for surf. Children could tell you which bank the wire hut stood on and which willow concealed a shore sentinel. They grew up speaking fluent mine doctrine without knowing the words. It is not healthy for children to learn these things. They learn them anyway. There were moments of chivalry, absurd and real, that punctuated the fear. Opposing picket boats hailed each other with warnings when a device had drifted free and threatened both sides. A Confederate officer sent word that a field had been disarmed to allow the passage of a truce boat under flag, and the word proved good. A Union captain wrote thanks and kept the note folded in his pocket long after. War contains compartments. In one you lay traps. In another you honor a flag. The men who lived it could move between compartments when the hour required. That is worth remembering when we are tempted to paint with one color only. Maps bloomed with pencil marks that meant more than longitude and latitude. A clerk would add tiny ticks to indicate where a sweep had snagged something, circles where divers felt cases with hands numb in cold water, dotted lines where spies reported a wire. These were living documents. They went out of date as quickly as a rumor. The best navigators learned to sail with a chart in one hand and skepticism in the other. They briefed crews not with certainty but with probabilities. Their men respected them for that. False certainty kills faster than fog. When I say the word diver, do not picture a man in a modern suit with air pumped from a tidy deck engine. Picture a man with a weighted belt, a hood that leaks, a hose that kinks, and friends on a boat who must keep rhythm with a hand on a pump handle as if they are playing music that keeps a heart beating. The diver steps off, descends blind, gropes along the bottom with gloves that turn fingers into clumsy sticks, and finds a case by bumping his hip against it. He must decide whether to cut, tie, or pray. He makes small decisions for which he receives no medal when he guesses right, and no ceremony when he guesses wrong, beyond the ceremony of a flag over a box. Minds create these private theaters. They deserve remembrance equal to any parade. Let us add a night of thunder on the Tennessee, because the air and water wrote sentences together. Lightning stitched crooked seams across low clouds. Each stitch counted a second before thunder and a second after nerves returned. The ship moved as if through a dream, where the riverbed rose and fell under her like breathing. Somewhere ahead, a device waited with a wire that hummed a tune only frogs could hear. On shore, the operator counted with lightning, not because he needed to, but because men count in storms to feel less like animals. He pressed the key, and for an instant lightning and explosion pretended to be the same god. Men on deck fell, because hearing vanishes in that second, and balance depends on hearing more than pride admits. The ship lived by luck and draft. She cleared the worst of it, and the operator clenched his jaw until his teeth hurt, because the timing had been a hair wrong. He would dream that hair for years. We must also write of morale in the long shadow of mines. Crews on sweep boats developed a humor so black it glowed. They named rakes and chains and poles as if the tools were pets. They told stories about barrels that chased them, about wires that grew out of nothing, about the one time a grapnel snagged a catfish the size of a dinghy. They laughed too loudly because laughter keeps hands from shaking. On the opposite bank, men who laid fields grew irritable because too many friends thought the work easy. Carry a case once, they wanted to say. Hold a breath in warm brown water while tying a knot under time's hand. Sit at a key for 6 hours and then go home and be normal with your children. They did not say it. They went back to the hut and watched a channel grow dark. Strategy flowers from these small human truths. A general who understands that fear drives fuel consumption plans more coal. An admiral who understands that boredom breeds mistakes rotates crews more often. A colonel who understands that river work steals sleep from infantry sentries posts extra eyes at dawn. None of this is glamorous. All of it puts inches of water between a hull and a blast. The inches matter. Post-war memory chose its heroes carefully and sometimes unfairly. Big guns on parapets photograph well. Mines hide their glory in mud. Yet the veterans themselves knew. Reunions included the men with rakes and keys. Toasts were raised to the torpedo lads, as some called them, with affection that outsiders find peculiar until they remember that sailors always loved the men who made it possible for them to come home. Monuments did not rise, but toasts did. That is a monument of a different kind. Before we close, place this doctrine in a sentence that reaches beyond its century. Do not meet strength with strength, if terrain will let you meet it with patience. Use the enemy's need to move as your ally. Force him to behave as if every yard were mined, even when only every tenth is. Keep him in the realm of as if. The phrase as if is where fear lives and time is lost. If you can make an army or a fleet live there, your barrels have done more than burst. They have bent a campaign. Finally, return one last time to the vocabulary. Infernal machine was a term of contempt and awe tangled together. Torpedo was the professional's word of the day for a mine that sleeps. Mine is the word that survived because it is blunt and true. Whatever you call it, the thing that mattered was the choice it forced. Go slow, spend time, risk much, or turn away. In that trinity of choices, you can hear the quiet victory of a small workshop on a muddy bank. We have traveled far in this telling, down channels and into huts, across decks and through ledgers. The hour is full, and the river is still moving. The last image belongs to no one, and to everyone who ever worked water in war. A soft wake slides along reeds, a buoy tips twice and settles. A hut door opens, and a man steps into night to listen without breathing. A ship far off breathes smoke across stars. Somewhere below the surface, a simple device waits with the patience of mud. Everything important in this story happens in the space between a fingertip on a key and a column of water rising into starlight. In that space, a nation tried to make time its ally. For a while, along certain banks, it succeeded.